In the mid-80s, video game music was still at its infancy. Game designers were just beginning to realize just how much sound effects could add to a game, and hardware was beginning to catch up to the growing demands of companies. The video game crash of 1983 saw many companies going under. Video game hardware was oversaturated with too much of the same, and innovation was suffering. It was no surprise that gamers were eager to get their hands on Nintendo's newest piece of hardware, the Famicom in Japan, more commonly known as the Nintendo Entertainment System in North America. It was an extremely powerful console. Nearly every specification outclassed most of the consoles that were available at the time. The audio hardware included had a whopping 5 sound channels, including one that had the ability to play PCM sample sound. The sound generated by the chip went largely unmatched for years to come. The Commodore 64 often came close, but the Nintendo Entertainment System's success made it the icon it is today. The NES was launched in Japan in 1983. It came stateside 2 years later with a groundbreaking game, Super Mario Bros. The title changed the face of platformers forever. Koji Kondo, the game's composer, created a set of 6 songs for the game's soundtrack. Each was inserted to match the player's mood at specific points of the game. For example, the death music would mock the player with its playful melody, while the triumphant flag music would congratulate a player for finishing a stage. In fact, several of the track tempos were edited to more accurately represent what was happening on screen. For example, as you were running out of time, the standard theme would double in speed, much like Space Invaders' bassline as they moved closer to the player. Super Mario Bros. Can be safely credited as having one of the most recognizable songs in a video game. It's probably one of the only tracks that people can distinguish without ever having played it. The extreme widespread fame of the soundtrack is proof of just how revolutionary the game was. This change in the way we saw music was vital to the advancement of immersion in video games. More and more developers were realizing just how much composed music could add to a game. Certain pieces could completely manipulate a player's mood. One of the best examples of music finally being used to add to the atmosphere is another Nintendo title, Metroid. Released in Japan in 1986 and a year later in North America, the game was another attempt by Nintendo's post-Zelda drive to give players a non-linear atmospheric game. Hirokazu Tanaka, Metroid's composer, said he wanted to make a score that made players feel like they were encountering a living organism and had no distinction between music and sound effects. This method of creating an organic-sounding composition worked. The music made players feel claustrophobic and tense, creating an atmosphere that could almost be described as a horror game. It was one of the first times music was used to the effect of impacting a player's emotions negatively. Interestingly, much of the game's soundtrack was largely minimalistic. It's a great example of how even a lack of music can add to the immersion of a player, since the atmosphere becomes much more apparent when sections of the game are silent, other than the creepy sound effects. With Metroid and Super Mario Bros., Nintendo was on a streak. They had already released the extremely successful adventure game Legend of Zelda, and thus had established 3 enormous franchises that would carry them years into the future. But what of third-party developers? It's rather fascinating to note how many familiar franchises got started on the NES and helped amateur and intermediate composers build a name for themselves. Mega Man, Final Fantasy, Castlevania, Dragon Quest, and even Gradius were all massive hits for their respective companies, and were likely what made their publishers the powerhouses they are today. What's even more interesting is how recognizable so many of the songs from the third-party games are years later. Much like Super Mario Bros., Mega Man has a ton of tracks that are fairly well integrated into pop culture. The contrast between the upbeat tone of Mega Man's music and the low, creepy vibe Metroid radiated is a good example of how something as simple as a change in tempo or scale can change the mood. Thanks to the incredible music these games had, video game soundtracks began to sell on cassette tapes in Japan in the late 80s. This move to create high-quality compositions for video games finally resonated in North America when companies like Sierra and Interplay began to take video game music more seriously. It's important to remember the Nintendo Entertainment System as the console that completely changed the face of gaming. Without it, it's likely that game development would have continued to remain stunted after the game market crashed for many years to come, ensuring that not only would gameplay not improve, but much of the video game music we cherish from later years would be absent. Franchises that Nintendo and friends started clearly continued in the years to come. Join me next time as I go over some of the best game compositions following the NES on hardware that could barely scratch what we have today.